Welcome to Discovering with Dr. Deb. Our last season, we were discovering the Enneagram with Dr. Deb, and it was packed with a lot of information while also being a lot of fun to talk about and explore the Enneagram and why we do what we do. So go back and check out those episodes if you haven't seen them already. Here we are in season 2, and I'm going to be focusing on trauma and using EMDR therapy as a tool to help process trauma. My co-host for this season is psychologist Dr. Christie from Austin, Texas. She has traveled all over the world to provide EMDR in humanitarian efforts, and she has also trained clinicians and providers in EMDR therapy. So get ready, let's dive right in and talk about trauma. Hello, welcome to this episode. Today we are going to be talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and how we utilize EMDR to help clients that have been experiencing symptoms from PTSD. And they even now have CPTSD, which is complex PTSD, right? So I think it really got a lot of attention when we think back to like veterans.
Yes.
You know, we look back to veterans and they were, experienced the effects of the war, things that they were exposed to, things that they had to do just to do their job and to keep us safe. Yeah. And so I think sometimes when clients come in and I go, ooh, this is like a traumatic response and they may have PTSD and we want to look at that a little closer, they tend to discount it because it's like, well, I wasn't in a war, or I wasn't in an accident or something. So help us unpack a little about what PTSD is and how it affects our brain and then therefore traumatic responses.
It's pretty fascinating, actually. It goes even into childhood. If young people have had PTSD or exposure to trauma, whether that's a death in the family, whether that's a sibling dying, whether that is Uvalde, horrible to bring all these things up, but if any of those things happened to somebody at a young age, for one, remember that they get locked in the nervous system and in their brain and then the neural network and can get triggered constantly throughout their life, and it sort of builds. So more discomfort. So it might be easily startled. It might be hypervigilance. It might be, just this wide variety, startle responses, nightmares, headaches.
Even numbing out.
Numbing,
yeah,
correct.
Yeah.
And dissociating.
Dissociating, right?
So anything that they can manage to get away from what actually happened and either compartmentalize it or, or not, and suffer through nightmares, flashbacks. I mean, it can be pretty extreme. The funny or not so funny thing about PTSD is that it just takes a little bit of something. And by the way, this is an addition to other podcasts that we have done, but if you have that kind of trauma as a child, you tend to age more rapidly.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's a hot off the press.
It would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it fascinating. So, PTSD is something that we just don't have to live with, and and as you say, we just sort of like minimize it. It was a case where this wife and husband had done some remodeling on their home, and I'm just going to tell you this because it's like this is how simple it can be. And they remodeled the house, and then their boys came to stay with them over the weekend, and they had a little casita, and they had it out there. That's where the remodeling had been done. And the husband says, "Now, honey, we've got to keep an eye on that new furnace because it could explode if we're not careful." And when he said that, she took it to heart, thinking like this kind of exploded. He was just meaning it would be water everywhere. Okay. So in the middle of the night, there comes a lightning storm overhead, and it was bam, like so loud, it shook everything. One of those like that happened once or twice in your lifetime. I mean, it was amazing one, I was told. And she sat up in bed thinking, the boys are dead.
Yeah, it's
the
blown
house
up.
Exploded.
Right.
And she's looking over her husband, and her husband's laughing because he thinks it's so funny because they got woken up in the middle of the night by this loud bang and thunderbolt.
Yeah. And what are you afraid of?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's so silly.
Yeah.
Well, no, she had this impression of what had happened.
Right.
And so actually, as a result of that, and I guess that's not such a minor case, really. I mean, it's kind of scary, even just talking about it for me. He was like, ugh. Anyway, so, but as a result of that, she, she'd startle easy. She was having dreams and anxious and oh, I mean, it was just really amazing. That's PTSD.
You're right.
Okay, not war.
Yeah.
It's just this misconception of a noise.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, and it can be anything. I know several, from hurricanes.
Yes.
They might have been told to evacuate, and they've evacuated countless times before.
Yes.
Hurricanes coming, evacuate. They've evacuated, and then this time they don't evacuate because they're not really in the direct path. But you know how those things happen. They turn.
Yes.
And then they get hit, and then they have this shame, embarrassment, guilt. I brought this on myself. I didn't respond correctly. But they have all of those symptoms. They are hypervigilant. They're fearful. They've got nightmares. They're looking back over what should I have done differently. So there's a lot of rumination even. So when we have that, that's just one event,
Yeah.
And when you look back, even doing some history taking, and you see other things that have happened in their lives.
Yes.
This is where we lead more towards complex
Yes, that's
PTSD.
right. That's exactly right. And I'll just say this: it's like we have lived through a tornado, right? My family lived through a tornado recently, and it's not even just the incident and the destruction
Right.
and the loss of life or near loss of life.
Correct.
I mean, or anything. It doesn't stop there. It keeps on giving.
Yes.
Like
it
the
is.
next rainstorm
Yes.
happens, and then
Yes.
the next high wind, and then, so it's like it is churning, and it's horrible. It's horrible to live with that. But the complex is a whole nother thing. This is, complexity comes from like talking to individuals who have had it since really maybe the minute they were born, whether they were like really, really horribly tortured, all kinds of sexual abuse, all kinds of that kind of thing, for their whole entire life,
Right,
or even
right.
if they were just yelled at,
Right.
a lot,
or
but
just neglect.
neglect.
I say it like that, and I feel badly for. It's not just neglect.
Yes.
Like, I think we look at neglect as like it's minimal compared to other things, but neglect, children that felt like my parents never put their phone down, I didn't really have any attention, my emotional and mental and physical often needs were not met.
That's right.
That is a contributing factor to complex PTSD.
Totally contributing, and what I have learned over the years is that because I started at basically the beginning of EMDR, I only thought, you had to have these big, huge things happen for you to have PTSD, right? And for you to also to have things emotionally from the past.
Right.
No, we discovered that it can be just the neglect, and I say just the neglect again.
We did it again.
I
Yes.
mean, because we just didn't think it was that big of a deal,
Right.
but it happens to be bigger
Yeah.
than the actually being beaten and fighting in the home and other larger seeming incidents. So it's equally as damaging. Found that fascinating too. Yeah.
Well, because it plants that seed too. And when you look at trauma, and we've talked about EMDR, and we're having them identify an instance, a memory, and it may be a time when they needed something and their needs weren't met. And then what is that negative cognition? I'm not important. I'm not lovable.
Yes.
I'm not good enough. That lends itself to trauma responses.
That's exactly right.
So the next time something happens and their needs are not met. And when you look at neglect, let's just say, most often it's not just a monthly thing, it's a weekly thing, a daily thing, an hour by hour thing. If they've been neglected and they haven't had their attachment and emotional needs met, I mean, that's the hierarchy of needs right here.
Yes.
It's really towards the bottom, it's one of the most important ones. So when those people have not been grounded in a safe, secure attachment, everything that happens in their life then, where they feel, I'm a failure, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable,
Yes.
there's something wrong with me, I'm broken. And that's the lens through which they see the world then.
That is exactly right.
Right, which is what lends to the complex.
Well, then the brain starts to look for examples of how that's true.
And they prove it.
Yes.
In their mind, they look at it and they say, oh, see, I knew that was true. I
Yes.
knew that was true about me.
Exactly.
I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable.
Mm-hmm.
Right, right. And so when things happen, instead of going, well, that was unfortunate, or that was their fault, it's all internalized about how defective they are.
That's right.
Right.
And when you're working with a complex case, like in the EMDR world, I think about, we were talking about veterans and people in the military, and I did lots of trainings up at Fort Hood, and for many years, so like 6 years altogether. But anyway, that is a distinct population, and sometimes some of these things, these are cultural issues as well.
Sure.
What's the culture of the military? How were you treated?
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
And then you add on childhood trauma, you have sort of a really red hot situation.
Absolutely.
And so
Because you're not supposed to have needs.
yes, that's right.
Right.
And
And guess what? We all have them.
that's right. and if you, well, even if you were abused, and all the types of abuse that are possible, well, how do you kind of deal with that person? And one thing is, I like to say, is just with kid gloves. You want to be very gentle and caring and mindful that this is, the words that you're talking about, unpacking. You'll do it, you'll titrate it. You will do it according to what is the right speed for that individual. And very likely you're going to start with the childhood, believe it or not, and then go to the military experience if that's they usually will come in for that. So again, if they come in for that, you got to treat that first. But this earlier experience prepares them to have a lifelong reaction, the same reaction as you were just saying.
Yeah.
And actually makes them more susceptible to
Yeah.
developing full-on PTSD.
Right. So one thing we have not mentioned at all, surprisingly, in any of our episodes, and this is something you share in your trainings, clustering, how the brain will cluster.
Yes.
So sometimes people will do a history taking, right? And they will identify numerous traumas in their life. And I had one client who said to me, are we going to have to do EMDR on all of these? Like, this is a lot. And I was like, it is a lot. You're absolutely right, And I explained how the brain will cluster things together. And we don't know how that works, and it's unique to them. But talk just a minute about how the brain does that and what that means exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the beauties of EMDR in my mind is that exactly.
Yes.
Do I have to go through everything that has happened to me?
Right.
I don't know that I'm willing to do that.
Exactly.
Right? So no, you don't have to, number one.
Yeah.
And we found that we can choose, say you had 5 experiences that were exactly the same. I mean, different experiences, but
similar.
Yes, similar. Similar enough to where you can go put all those 5 together and tell me which of these represents all of them. And that's we're clustering. We actually make the cluster, right? And so then we pick the one that was the worst and represents all the others. We'll focus on that particular memory. And when we do that, our hope is that it will take care of all the rest, the whole entire 5,
Right.
and that all of those will come down to a 0 level of disturbance.
Right.
And it happens very frequently. So,
Right.
so no, do you have to? The other thing I have to mention now,
Yes.
because of that, is this: we may be working on these torturous things, and I hate to build it up that way, but sometimes these things are extremely painful and horrific.
Right.
Okay. So the reality is, it just depends.
There's a
on your
lot of
history.
ugly stuff.
A lot
out
of
there.
ugly
Yeah.
stuff. It's not so easy to do, right? And in focusing on that, by doing the clusters, one, the new material that comes up, which is, it was not my fault. I was for this or the other. I did not want that to happen to me. Those kinds of things. You get stronger in your own knowledge that, no, this is not something I deserve for the rest of my life.
Right.
How to feel about myself or the situation. But that begins to sort of build on itself, and as a consequence, when we have to work on other disturbing materials, say maybe at a different age, something else happened, that we begin to develop resilience with EMDR. So even if it's this heavy duty and hard as we started out, which is usually the hardest in the beginning,
Yes.
that over time you can face those same issues and those same horrors at a different age, but you have developed a resilience, an ability, a strengthening to where you can handle them more easily. So it doesn't really sort of dysregulate you
Right.
like it might.
I think one of my experience has been sometimes that negative cognition has shifted, and it might not quite be as negative as it was before we targeted the first thing.
Yes.
And then even sometimes if we haven't clustered it, they will look at other circumstances. So this is what happened with one of my clients, and we targeted an early memory, and her negative cognition was, I am helpless.
Okay.
And we got it to a 0, and we planted in phase 5 the positive cognition, right? And we did the body scan, and so we looked at, I said, what's next? What's next on our history taking? Where do we want to go now? And it was like, well, that one really is not bothering me anymore. Like that one, and okay, so we jumped because, like you're saying,
correct.
the brain kind of just clustered all those. Like you have this new resilience and this new belief about yourself because we're looking at the negative as you think back about that. Like now,
Correct.
you're not even saying, what did you think then? It's like now when you look back at that, what are you telling yourself about yourself? So they have this newfound belief, so it doesn't fit, and these other things, amazingly, aren't as disturbing. Or disturbing at all sometimes if we got that first one down to a 0. But maybe we did, but some of these are still like, oh, it's still not good. Okay, well, do we want to target that one?
That's right. And there's research that shows that, like, when you're working with EMDR, this is another mind-blowing thing to me. But if you're working with EMDR and like that, maybe maybe that's not finished, maybe it's not complete. Over time, the brain does not stop working.
Absolutely.
And we've done research on that for 1.5 years that actually continues to improve without any
Bilateral
stimulation or even therapy. And Bessel van der Kolk did a study on this in actually Prozac and EMDR, and it was people didn't want that published, but it got published. Because it shows that, you stop taking Prozac and you're going to go back to the same state you were. Some percentage of the population does not, just for everybody to know that. But anyway, that it held for EMDR and it continued to improve.
Wow.
To me,
that's amazing.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And that goes back to, we've talked in earlier episodes, how the brain heals itself, right?
Yes.
And we are just offering them, really, the opportunity to help kickstart that.
That's right.
And then the brain is going to go where the brain needs to go for healing.
That's right. And you can't really, I mean, most of us are kind of like amazed. Even as a therapist, I'm amazed. I'm like,
I know.
whoa.
I know.
Yeah. So anyway, I think are we wrapping up for today?
No, I wanted to kind of touch on too, with PTSD, there's still a stigma about it. I mean, we won't go too much about military, but like but they still, like, they don't want to lose rank.
Yes.
They don't want to, and that's so unfortunate. And then other professions, medical professionals, like there's definitely things that happen in some of these professions. You even mentioned attorneys, and I was like, what? I hadn't even thought about that. But so there's still a stigma about that. And I think of course, it's just, they say the more we talk about it and bring awareness to it and everything. I think too, I've had some clients lately, like they've used EMDR. We've done EMDR with them. And they're such believers at the relief it's given them in their life and kind of a newfound lease on some aspects of their life that they are then telling others. And I think that's so important, that not just us as providers say, hey, this is really a great tool. This is something that can really help you in your healing journey. But for people that experience it, like to do that, to kind of not have stigma about, I'm getting counseling, I'm using EMDR, but just the fact that this has been like really a game changer
Yes.
for them.
Oh, so much so.
Yeah.
It frees them up,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And it's interesting you talk about that stigma and,
Mm-hmm.
and acceptance. For one, the Europeans have just like accepted, actually, for the most part. I got to tell you some stories on this, but they sort of like totally went hog wild over EMDR. And
Yeah.
we in the United States have been throttling back, kind of going like, well, I'm not so sure, you know, this is working, right? Well, of course, now we have so much research backing us. But what's interesting, those are professionals, okay? But the population still believes, I'm not depressed. No, I am not.
Yeah.
I don't need medication. That's
Right.
like, you are weak if
Right.
you have medication.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
weak if you get therapy. You are weak if you get EMDR. And so it still persists.
It is, yeah.
You know, out there. And I'm sure in the U.S. too, but I think the U.S. is kind of starting to really recognize the importance of mental health, which is fabulous. The horrible COVID and pandemic that we all experienced sort of brought that to light.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me.
Yeah, I do wish to, and I teach clinical mental health, but I do wish programs would, you know, have some more information about EMDR. Maybe not as a therapeutic model, you know, when they do theories.
Yes.
But just as a way to have a conversation about topics or diagnoses that you can use to treat it. We haven't ever talked about like eating disorders, which is
Yeah.
kind of an anxiety disorder, but you can use it for that. Not to mention, obviously, we just covered like complex PTSD and
Yes.
PTSD, OCD, depression, grief,
Yes.
whole host of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and it can be used
Bipolar.
in tandem, right, with
Even-
other therapeutic models.
Yes.
So, I mean, it would be great for, you know, for that. And that would also help too, I think, with stigma, you know, just giving more validation for it as a model.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Has to be talked about more.
Mhm.
It seems to be coming to mind, and to the, you know, to the media. So that's good too.
Yeah. Well, I know, you know, when there's a major life event, natural disaster or tragedy or something, there does bring awareness to it. I just wish there would be maybe a little more just in mainstream everyday life. There are a lot of people that still are resistant or reluctant. And then there's even, you know, like, I don't know what you know, like we talked about in the episode about myths, you
Yes,
know, like,
yes.
is it, no, it's going to be okay, let's give it a try. But anyway, we need to do a little more psychoeducation.
We do indeed.
About
we
it.
do indeed.
Well, yeah.
go
No,
ahead.
what did you want
Well, I
to?
was just going to, anytime somebody asks me to speak about it, I do. I don't care where they want me to go, how many people will be there.
Yes.
But I take the opportunity to
Yes.
try to get the word out, you know.
Yes, I think those that are trained and certified need to take those opportunities too. I know I do every semester with my internship students. They all hear it multiple times.
Aw, that's
So,
wonderful.
yes, and I'm looking forward to, you know, trainings that you're going to be offering where you show what it looks like, and that I think that will help too to destigmatize.
Great.
So be watching for that. That'll be coming up. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. If this content has been helpful to you, I'd appreciate it if you would please rate the podcast, post it, and share it on social media. And also post a review. If you'd like to get in contact with me, my phone is 479-561-7600, or email Dr. Deborah at anchoredhopecounseling.net or Dr. Deborah at drdebfordoctors.com. Our website at www.anchoredhopecounseling.net has some useful information, and you can also reach out to me through the website. Remember, you are enough just the way you are, and you are loved.